All right. We're going to go ahead and get started with our last portion of the day, the most exciting portion, where we're going to get to solutions, answers, and really some hope, because there is a path forward to funding our communities. There is a path forward to having dignity. And we have some amazing panelists today with us. I also want to say there was someone in the audience that said, your staff is really cool. And I appreciated that, because as researchers and data nerds, we don't really hear that a lot. So thank you. I've got to really, that's going to stick with me. All right. Also, the older I get, the less cool I am. So thank you. All right. Well, I hope you enjoyed some refreshments, maybe fresh air, got to talk to people that you usually just see on Zoom. And we're going to come back to our keynote, which is Revenue as the Solution for Prosperity and Safety, which will lay out the options and the solutions on the table for the current economic crisis our state faces as a result of the federal mega bill, and just our long-time broken tax code. As you remember, it hasn't been updated significantly since 1935. So 100-year tax code, let's look back at it. And offer next steps with a vision for progressive revenue in Washington. We're going to have the panel moderated by Emily Vananek, and we have visuals by our wonderful senior policy analyst, Mia Shigemura, who does so much of our budget and tax research, and many of the graphs you've all come to love, especially in this past year, are made by Mia, so you're getting to meet the person behind the visuals. And let's introduce our panelists. First up, we have Representative Sean Scott from the 43rd. He serves as Vice Chair of Labor and Workforce Standards Committee, fun, and sits on the House Education and Finance Committees, also fun. Member of the Seattle Democratic Socialists of America since 2017. Sean is the first socialist elected to the Washington State Legislature since 1912. And next up, we have Senator Noelle Frame, who represents the 36th Legislative District, who's dedicating her work to advocating for youth involved in foster care and juvenile justice systems, expanding services for individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities, and especially championing economic development and fixing our state's upside-down tax code. Next up, we have Fatima Boxwala, who's a progressive activist, software engineer, and artist, multifaceted, living in Seattle. She's the coalition leader of Tech for Taxes and is the director of operations for Revolutionary Grains. And I just want to give a shout out, please, we'll include this in the follow-up email, but Tech for Taxes website, they have some amazing information and graphs and data around really exploring a lot of the myths we hear from tech and corporate lobbyists about the harm they're going to experience with different progressive revenue, and she's just really been honing in on that and has some great information on her website. And then we have Marco Guzman, who's a senior analyst with the National Institute on Taxation and Economic Policy, ITEP. We've been working with ITEP for many years. They're so deeply aligned on our values around racial wealth redistribution and taxation. And Marco provides research and analysis specifically that helps support state policymakers across the country, including many both in the Great Plains and the Southwest. And we're so excited to have your perspective here as we look at Washington State within a national lens. All right, well, I'm going to hand it over to Emily and Mia.
Great. Thank you so much for staying for the keynote. I'm really excited for the conversation. Just want to give some bearings as to how we're going to do this, because we have Mia, who has done such a great job making these visual graphics that are going to kind of help ground our conversation. And Mia will take some time to explain what's going on in the graph. Some graphs are more complex than others. And then we're going to ask our great lineup of panelists a series of different questions. So let's kick it off with our very first one.
All right, thank you. Okay, this graph is back. This graph from ITEP's work is one that we've been using for decades, and we've long known that Washington's tax code is upside down, and that the people who earn the least are also paying the highest percentage of their income in taxes.
So this is a question for everybody, because this is a graph that is basically our why as an organization as to why we show up to this fight. So can you speak to your personal why around why you're committed to the fight for fixing the Washington state tax code? Let's start with Representative Scott first.
So I think previous to this year, for many people, the question of what the stakes actually were for tax justice may have been an abstract question. I think that, those of us that are very, very close to this conversation, or who have been close to it for many years, have fallen into a little bit of a bad habit, maybe, of speaking about tax justice in terms of really tedious percentages, unfathomably large dollar amounts, and referencing tax policy as opposed to tax impact. So the reason why I love this question is because it's sort of recentering us in exactly what you said, which is the why. The why in my district in the 43rd LD is parents and students, teachers who can't understand why public education has been in a state of disrepair and underfunded and has been underfunded for many years. The why in the 43rd legislative district is renters in a district that is 70% renters, people who can't understand why it is that affordable housing is so scarce, why it is that the outcomes of the state legislature seem to privilege the interests of people who own property as opposed to those who rent it. And the why in the 43rd legislative district, which I have to say for many years did send an open socialist as well to the city council for a full decade. People can understand why in a state that is as wealthy as ours, we have people who are living on the street, people who are unable to afford food and other basic necessities. I'm somebody who came from a household who depended on food stamps when I was very young, coming up in Queens and then later on here in the city of Seattle. So a lot of these programs that we're talking about as being on the chopping block right now, be it because of local austerity budgeting, state level austerity budgeting, or federal austerity budgeting, these are programs that a lot of people depend on as a real economic lifeline. So I think that for many communities, this is not a matter of one policy consideration or another. It's the difference between starving or thriving. It's the difference between going to school or not. It is the difference between being able to afford in a place where you actually wanted to come up and live and being displaced somewhere. So I think the whys are really many, especially in a district like the 43rd, and I think should be for a state like Washington, which has many wealthy people. Why are we still having these conversations? I think that's a real why for a lot of people too.
Exactly. Give it up. Fatima, I'm going to invite you to go next, if you can share your why with us.
Yeah, so like I was mentioned, I run a coalition called Tech for Taxes, and I've worked in tech for the majority of my career, the past 6 years. And I don't come from an incredibly wealthy background or anything. My parents were immigrants. I grew up in Canada, and then I immigrated here to work for tech companies. And I think any person that has a conscience can tell that there's a lot that is wrong in the world, and there's a lot of suffering that doesn't need to exist. I don't know if like a graph has ever made you cry, but the one that we saw with the child poverty rates going down to 5.2 and back up, that was like really hard to look at. And so getting a lot of income suddenly as a tech worker, I was like, dang, like I have all this money, like what do I do? Like how do I make an impact with the things that I now have access to? And I think since then, growing in my understanding of how states work and politics, and like I understand that the best way for us to fund social services that are going to improve people's quality of life is through raising revenue from people like me and other people who have that income, who can afford to support other people, rather than me trying to decide what the best way to make monthly donations are. So that's kind of why I started Tech for Taxes, and I care so much about tax policy now. It's like the only thing I can talk about.
Give it up for Fatima. Thank you. Marco, let's go with you.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for having me, and it's a great question. Yeah, I started working at ITEP back in 2020. I had a great professor that got me into tax policy, helped me understand how important it is, and how little a lot of people know about it. So, tax policy can be dense, intimidating, but at ITEP, it's nice to work with a lot of smart people to help bring clarity to the conversation, to help bring data that supports, a lot of our partners and advocates in the work that they do. Washington is, facing budget deficits. They can either lean further on regressive revenues, or they can choose a different path. And, it's up to us to help them go down that other path, that path of progressivity. And we can't cede this ground. That's another reason why, because moneyed interests will step in. They will shape things the way they want it to be shaped. And right now is a perfect time to get in this fight. I recently read a Bloomberg article. It was talking about the national economy. They used the metaphor. They called it a Jenga tower. Jenga, that game where the wooden blocks, you pull them out and the tower could fall over at any moment. That's not great for our national economy. They mentioned that the richest 10% of households, they're fueling almost half of all spending in the U.S. And that's compared to low-income, middle-income families that are pulling back, struggling with inflation, cost of living. So again, it's really up to us to help go down that path of progressivity. Emily brought up Washington and the One Big Beautiful Bill Act and its effect on Washington, and how the top 1% will see a tax cut of over $90,000, an average tax cut of over $90,000 in 2026 alone. So yeah, there's plenty of work to do, and not to mention I'm a new resident here in Washington, so I've got some actual skin in the game, and ready to help fight.
We're glad to have you. All right, let's round us out. Senator Frame.
Thanks, Emily. Can you hear me okay? Yes, you can. First of all, I just want to just pause before we start and say thank you to the Budget and Policy Center for hosting us today. You all are incredible partners and champions. We've been doing this work together for 15 years, and we've been doing work together with this chart for 15 years. So also shout out to ITEP for the incredible work of helping us really help the residents of Washington State understand just how deeply unfair and upside down our tax code is. So big credit to y'all. The question of the why, sorry for those folks who've heard the origin story, I won't go into too much depth here, but I started out as a public school funding champion, as somebody who grew up in the Battleground School District that did not fund our public schools, and I figured out in high school in the 90s that there was something there about taxes that I needed to figure out. And I, here I am, I'm 45, and I'm fighting the same exact fight that I was fighting when I was 16 years old, which is challenging to think about. But I think it probably gives you a little glimpse into why at a personal level, I'm so rooted in this. Second reason, somebody's got to do it. And just as a member of the legislature showing up and just having the privilege of sitting on the Finance Committee for 7 years and now on the Ways and Means Committee, like somebody's got to nerd out and do the work and dig in deep and figure it out. And it is a privilege every single day that I get to do that. But the real why at the end of the day is this is about fairness. Like it's about everything that Rep. Scott said. Like Washington State is an amazing place to live, to work, to raise a family, and it's increasingly completely and utterly unaffordable for regular people to do that. And like, I don't want to live in a community that is not as rich and diverse and beautiful as the state that I grew up in. I want to have a future for Washington State where it's not just a rich person's playground. Like I don't want to be called the Cayman Islands of the United States. I appreciate that Professor Vigner called that out. But like, it's not okay to me as a Washingtonian that we collectively make these investments in this beautiful state, in our schools, in our institutions, in our infrastructure. And a fraction of people are profiting off of that and not paying in the way that they should. I just don't think that that's right. I will also say, I think increasingly, I am very concerned about the deep connection between tax policy and the influence on our democracy. And I think the One Big Beautiful Bill, one big disaster bill, really painted that picture at the federal level, but y'all, like the influence of key actors in this state and the way that they weighed in on the tax policy fight this year was gross. And we collectively need to rise up and fight back and fight for the tax code that our state deserves to match our values as a state. So I'm in it to win it for the people of Washington State.
Hell yeah. That's going to get a hell yeah from me. Thank you. Thank you all. We're so happy that you're here. What a great way to start the panel. And let's go to our next graph.
Great, thank you. All right, I have a series of 2 graphs here. This first one shows how our state budget is funded, where the money comes from. And you can see that it's largely, the main parts of our tax code have been largely unchanged for almost 100 years. So over half of the budget really depends upon the sales tax. The second largest piece of the pie here is the business and occupation tax, or the B&O tax, which is really unique to Washington State. It's a tax on gross receipts or sales instead of profits. And so in ways it essentially ends up acting like another sales tax, unfortunately. And then the third biggest chunk here is the property tax. And then this graph shows how, as Washington's wealth has grown over the past 30 years, our state tax revenues are really not keeping up. We know that high-income earners and companies in this state have experienced a lot of economic growth. And in this graph, once we adjust our tax revenues for this economic growth, we see this steady downward trend. And so when you see something like this, it starts to make sense why the Washington legislature keeps finding itself in these budget deficits year after year, and why it always feels like there's not enough money to fund what we need in the budget, and also why people are feeling the pinch when it comes to affording the everyday.
All right, so this question is actually, we're going to invite Senator Frame and Rep. Scott to speak to this. Obviously the ability for people to make ends meet is a core theme of what we've talked about today, and deeply tied to how the budget is funded. As lawmakers, what are you hearing from your constituents about affordability, as well as and taxes in this moment, as well as from your colleagues? How does the conversation around affordability connect to our tax code and the way the budget is funded? Let's start with Senator Frame.
Thanks, Emily. We're hearing about affordability every single day from our constituents. And in the same way, we just saw a blue wave on Tuesday, particularly with wins in blue cities with candidates that are talking about affordability. We are hearing about it every day. I think the conversation around rent stabilization this last session is a very key indicator, housing being one of the biggest costs in a household. The energy around passing a rent stabilization bill was huge. Unfortunately, we got not the best version of the bill, but we definitely stopped the worst of the rent gouging with the bill that we passed. But that's a key issue there. We've been talking about the affordability around access to childcare for many years now, and of course, many of us were part of the capital gains fight and really connected the dots there with the capital gains tax to funding childcare. We're hearing a lot right now about access and affordability of healthcare. People are, as you might, stressed out is not the right, distressed is the right word. People are distressed that they are going to lose access to health insurance, and everybody knows that most households are just one medical incident away from bankruptcy, from losing their homes, et cetera. So I think there's an obvious connection to tax policy here in that the revenues that we generate are the ways that we fund some of those key programs, particularly things like childcare. But it's also on the other end of the spectrum as well, when people understand when they are paying disproportionately more of their income to taxes than the wealthiest households in the state, that's less money in their pocket to be able to pay for food, to be able to pay their rent, to be able to pay for childcare. And again, a shout out to ITEP. because of the work that we've done over the last 15 years, anchoring with this chart and the work that we've collectively done together, the people of Washington State understand that they are paying more than their fair share, and the wealthiest among us are not paying theirs. So more and more we are seeing those connections directly to the services that we have, and the services that, when people walk in and say, oh, there's just no money. I have a lot of constituents that are like, I don't believe you, look around, right? Like one of my colleagues in another state said, we're not broke, we got robbed. And I'm like, that is an apt description. Like, there is plenty of money in this state. We are simply choosing not to tax it. And when we finally have the courage to lean in and tax it equitably with the way that we already tax working families, we will have the resources we need to pay for the key programs that help make Washington an affordable place to live.
Thank you so much. Rep. Scott?
Right. It's a great series of points that Senator Frayne just made about some of those key programs. So prior to joining the legislature, after getting elected last November, I had worked for the Statewide Poverty Action Network for 4 years and had the opportunity to see up close what it looked like for the legislature to actually mobilize around some pretty big economic justice concerns, starting with the COVID-19 pandemic and the resulting economic slowdown. In the 3 or 4 years in between then and 2024, the state did pass a capital gains tax, created a Covenant Homeownership Act to remedy the long and very shameful legacy of housing segregation in Washington state. Shortly before this time period, took action on making college not just affordable but free for thousands of Washingtonians via the Workforce Education Act. So I think the thing that I hear often from many residents of the 43rd who have been paying attention to the legislature and understand the economic impact that it can have is, why did that progress seem to stall? Why was it after 3 or 4 years of tremendous gains on a lot of those questions did the state legislature this year, for example, make deep and very, very difficult cuts to programs like childcare, cutting public employee pensions, rolling back some of the gains of the Washington College Grant via the Workforce Education Account, as well as persisting a number of tax loopholes and major corporations to persist that also deprives the state of quite a bit of revenue. And so there's a feeling that there was a real positive impact that was made as far as students being able to go to college for free, childcare suddenly becoming much more affordable because of positive actions that the legislature took. Black and brown families who had been historically redlined, excluded from white neighborhoods in the city of Seattle and across the state. The legislature did quite a lot to progress on those questions, and I think that we should feel emboldened knowing that these are fights that we won recently, because they were fights that I think encapsulated what a lot of people's aspirations for the public sector were, which is when you have elected officials that come from working class backgrounds that fight for working class aims, amplifying working class voices, we can do really, really well and progress on these issues. So at a number of town halls, one earlier this year in March of this year, the last time that I had the chance to see my departed mentor, Speaker Emeritus Frank Chop, another Tax the Rich town hall that took place a couple of weeks ago, at which Tech for Taxes was present and ran a great photo booth where we were hearing directly from people about what the impact of positive tax policy would mean. I think it's a state of perplexement, I would say, generally, people not understanding why the progress that had been made in past years on these issues, there has not been quite as much of an appetite from their perspective as has been at an earlier point. That's the perspective.
Totally. I appreciate that. Thank you so much. We're going to go to our next graph because we have a question for our policy wonk in the House.
All right. So what this slide shows is how Washington State's tax code stacks up against the very best or the most progressive tax codes in the country, and that would be Minnesota, Vermont, and New York. And I know there's a ton going on this slide, and it can be a little overwhelming to look at, so I'm going to try to break it down a little bit first. So these bars under Washington, this is the exact same graph as we had on our first slide. So it shows, here from the lowest 20% income group to the richest 1% income group, what they're paying in taxes as a share of their income. And then we just have that same graph repeated, but with Minnesota, Vermont, and New York. And then in this graph, we also have each bar broken down into the type of taxes that are being paid. So in the blue here at the bottom, we have the sales tax. This yellow in the middle, we have the property tax. And then this red up top, we have income taxes. So you'll see in Washington State, of course, that we don't have the red, the income tax. And then looking at this, you'll kind of start to see why Washington State ranks so low, as well as why we call it an upside down tax code. Our bar graph here almost looks like a flipped version of these other bar graphs.
Thanks so much, Mia. Okay, Marco, this question's for you. So you study both state and federal tax codes. When you look at this graph, with Washington compared to other states that can get their tax code more right, there's a lot. What's something that jumps out to you? And what are areas of opportunity that Washington has to reform our tax code to be more progressive?
Yeah, when you talk about, the wealthy paying their fair share, somebody will inevitably say, well, what does fair share mean? You can point them to this graph right here. Because you see just, again, how upside down it is. And again, yeah, there's no red on Washington's bar graph. No income tax. The income tax in most states is not just a huge source of revenue, but it's a way to offset the regressivity of a state tax code. So Washington's completely missing that. Equity is a huge principle in taxes and tax policy, and equity based on ability to pay is key. These bar graphs are quite shocking. You see the lowest income families in the bottom 20% there paying a higher effective tax rate that's almost 3 times that of those households in the top 1%. Folks in the middle class, it's paying almost 2.5 times the 1%. Washington has a high reliance on regressive taxes, consumption taxes, sales excise. So that's boosting that bar. These other states, they have progressive income taxes with graduated rates. They've got refundable credits that they're able to kind of bring down that effective tax rate on the lower end. But you see, they're also not perfect. They are progressive through the bottom half, but then they get a little regressive at the top. So Washington doesn't have to be perfect. They just got to be a bit better. I know that's kind of loaded, but maybe it'll help in our fight. And then, the 49th position there, the ranking. We've covered it briefly previously, but Washington did, in our previous report, Who Pays report, where this data is from, did have the title of having the most inequitable tax system in the country, but they no longer have that. So that's something to be really proud of. One spot, but it took a ton of work from lawmakers and the people in this room, so you really deserve a round of applause and a lot of credit. Working in tax policy, state tax policy, it can, for some states, be 2 steps back, 1 step forward. So I know how much work went into that, and you all should be really proud. And then, this is a marathon, not a sprint, when it comes to changing your tax code. But it is possible. Massachusetts, in recent years, passed their fair share constitutional amendment, which was a 4% surcharge on income over $1 million. And they've raised, I think, recently almost $3 billion. And that's funding child care projects and transportation projects specifically, but free K through 12 meals. We've got transit-free rail projects, child care subsidies. You name it. They are suffering from success there. And that's not even. Massachusetts is one state, but there are also campaigns going on in Colorado, Michigan, Rhode Island right now, and folks are pushing for progressive revenues right now. So Washington isn't alone. So that's definitely something you could look to in your upcoming fights.
Thank you so much. And I can't wait for Washington to suffer from success someday. I'm gonna keep that one in my brain. Let's go to the next slide, which actually is not a graph. But it does lay out a couple of policies that are currently on the table for consideration in our state legislature. They both were dropped as bills last session and are at various stages within the legislative process, and are both progressive revenue raising mechanisms that have the opportunity to move forward again this session. A lot is being talked about in this moment of how we address, again, another forecasted budget revenue or budget deficit. So we know we need to do something. We have a couple of options on the table. Obviously, a lot is swirling. And I wanted to put these up here so in case you didn't know what they were, now you know. But I do have a question for you, Fatima. As an advocate in tech, can you speak to the policy option that's over here on the right-hand side, which is the high salary payroll tax? Why do you think tech companies are pushing back on it so much? We've obviously seen that quite a bit. And can you speak to, anything that comes to mind when you hear the phrase, this is a tax on jobs?
Yeah, I have so much to say about this, so I'll try to still talk slowly, so I think that's a problem that I have. What's really interesting on the graph we looked at just before, New York is one of the most progressive tax states in the country, and New York City continues to be the city with the highest rate of tech hiring. They continue to hire tech workers continue to want to live there. This is also true for California. Companies pay much more tax in California. Tech workers continue to get hired there. New York we have this research on our website, but New York had an increase in the statewide income tax for corporations a couple years ago, and then it was reaffirmed just recently. After those changes, tech hiring in New York continued to increase. Tech companies can't actually afford to make decisions about hiring based on what tiny % of tax they're paying in a state, because they're dependent on the actual workforce, where it exists, where those people want to live, and all of the decisions that people make. Washington State has the highest proportion of tech workers to non-tech workers in the country, and that's the fault of tech companies. We're here now, and they've invested millions and billions of dollars into creating a workforce here. It is not easy or cheap for them to try to move that workforce elsewhere, train that workforce elsewhere. If anything, trends that we're seeing more recently with layoffs and hiring changes is states that aren't the three main tech worker states, like Washington, California, and New York. Those are continuing to stay strong for tech hiring relatively, whereas things like Amazon's HQ2 was hit huge by the layoffs, and that's because they're taking those jobs out of places where they don't have as strong of a workforce and sending them to other countries like India because of federal immigration changes and federal tax changes. So I would say when tech companies say that this is a tax on jobs, they'll say whatever they want because the only thing they care about is their bottom line. There's a great book by Sarah Wynne Williams called Careless People about the way that the leadership at Facebook makes decisions. I worked at Facebook for 5 years. These people are so disconnected from reality. They, let me tell you, do not give a single shit about the average person in Washington, nor do they care about their workers. They don't care if they're going to be able to hire more workers in Washington or not. They just care about how much billion dollars they're gonna make that year. We did a little simulation about the 5% payroll tax on techfortaxes.org as well. So if you took a really generous definition of the law and you charged Microsoft a 5% payroll tax on their workers in Washington that would hit that threshold, it would still be 0.14% of their profit over a 12-month period. With the amount of money that we are talking about with these corporations is completely unfathomable, and it comes down to greed and paying people who are really smart to write narratives that will convince people. If anybody knows Brad Smith, I would love to have an open debate with him about this. I welcome him to come here on the stage and bring up these points to my face. Weirdly, he won't respond to my emails.
Thank you so much,
Can I
Fatima.
come watch?
I think that'll be a follow-up keynote panel after this. Great idea, Fatima. So switching gears a little bit towards the concept of a wealth tax. Obviously, the wealth tax has been in the news quite a bit over the past year. And there's been really broad public support across the state for this. So Senator Frame, can you talk to or speak to the barriers and opportunities there are to passing something like a wealth tax?
Thanks for the question, and I want to affirm exactly what you said. There is strong public support for this, in the high 60% in some of the research that we've done over the years, and it is cross-partisan. It crosses rural versus urban. It crosses age. It is something that people understand they are not going to pay, and they would like to see the wealthiest among us pay what they owe. So very strong public support. Who doesn't support it are those who want to hold on to their money. And Fatima, I could literally say rinse and repeat and put the mic down, but it's many of the same arguments. And I will tell you, we've been introducing the wealth tax bill since 2021 and trying to kind of listen to different arguments, different pushback, fine tune it. We have done everything to this bill that we could possibly do, and there is only one argument left. What do you think it is? They'll leave. That's it. The rich people will leave. That is the only argument they have left. And y'all, we know that the research tells us that's not true. That people, everything that Fatima said, they live here and work here because it's a great place to live and work. This is a great place to put down roots, build a business. It is a great place to be. And I fully expect that those who have profited from the labor of Washington residents and the investments we have collectively made, I expect them to contribute back. And with love and respect, philanthropy is not enough. Philanthropy is necessary, but it is not sufficient. Philanthropy is important for innovation. It's not sufficient to cover the basic needs of Washington residents. It is not a replacement. And, you know, I'm just going to take an opportunity to invite in some of our dear friends. We have some of the biggest leaders in global philanthropy right here in Washington State. They could choose to be leaders in this moment. They should read the room. They should look across this country and they should listen to the people about how much we are struggling, how many of our constituents are hanging on by a thread. What happens to people when SNAP benefits are cut off? The lines at the food banks that we are seeing. We are in an unprecedented moment in American history. And we have some of the wealthiest people in the world that call our state home. They have been leaders before. They can be leaders again. They can and should lead on tax reform, starting by publicly supporting the wealth tax. And, you know, y'all, I'll just say, in the conversations that I have been having, and I have a very strong open door policy as a legislator. I take all the meetings, and I am very transparent and direct with people. And I don't know if the word is shocked. It's not that. I think I'm disconcerted by the level of misinformation on this bill, where it's just a very emotional reaction from the community of folks that might pay this. And the corporations in the state, to your point, Fatima, they're not thinking about the workers that would benefit from the investments that we would make here. They're worried about whether or not they can attract C-suite executives. Isn't that something? That C-suite executives have $50 million or more in assets, and that's who we're worried about in designing our tax policy? Again, I have to just really invite in the leaders in our community to be part of the solution here, because at this point, it is for financial assets. They are publicly valued in the market every single day. This is as plain and simple as it can be, and it's making the property tax more equitable There's nothing left to do here. This is the right move to make. We are the right state to lead the charge, and many states will follow us should we take this first step. So I invite our leaders in our community to be a part of the solution.
Incredible. I want to be mindful for time, but if Rep. Scott or Marco, you have anything to add, you're welcome to. Great mic drop moments from Fatima and Senator Frame. Let's go to this last slide, and then we'll ask our last question.
Great. So I basically made this map, as when I was hearing like the they'll leave argument. And what this shows is each state, how much they tax the wealthiest 1%. So the states in orange tax the wealthiest 1% at rates that are lower than the national average, which is 7.2%. And then the states in blue charge a rate that's higher. So what you can see from this map that one, Washington is very much an outlier, and two, that there's really not that many states out there that give a better deal to the wealthiest 1% than Washington currently does.
Thanks for that map, Mia. I love this map. I think it tells an incredible story. So my question is for everyone. And we'll start with Rep. Scott, and then we'll move down. From your perspective, just what do you think it'll take to fix the way our tax code works? And what would meaningful progress look like coming out of the 2026 session so that we can have a tax code that prioritizes everyday people over the top 1%?
It's a great question, and just by way of description, when you go to Olympia during the state legislative session, it's quite a lot of bustle, a lot of people hurrying around, looking very important and whatnot. I remember distinctly one day, I believe it was in March of this year, was driving in, and it was a very sunny day. There was a guy, looked like he was probably about 55, 60 years old. He was standing on the steps of the Senate, where the Senate's offices are, kind of taking a selfie and, looking up, almost looked like he was staring directly into the sun. It was a very odd way to take a selfie. And as I drove a little bit closer, I realized that this was somebody who had actually had a meeting with very recently. It was somebody who was a lobbyist for the Boeing Corporation. And what stood out to me in this moment was, it was almost as if he was taking a picture like he was somebody who the voters sent to Olympia to represent his particular constituency. I mean, you see lawmakers do this all the time. But I think that there was something that kind of really rubbed me the wrong way about the arrogance of it in a lot of ways. Like, this person who is not actually sent here by any constituency, this person who represents one particular economic interest in a range of different economic interests that, culminate here at the Capitol in Olympia. And then you find out that, the 6 largest corporations in Washington state spent over $2 million of lobbying resources. That was a statistic from Balance Our Tax Code that provided that earlier on in this year. So Alaska Airlines, the Microsofts of the world, I think Costco may have been on that list. And $2.1 million is a fair amount of money when you go through and look at, the salaries, what that pays for. And what it pays for really is influence and access. It's when, a Boeing lobbyist or a lobbyist from a big corporation hears that you're working on an amendment that might claw back one of their big tax breaks that they've become very accustomed to in recent years. They'll kind of, chase after you and give you a very stern lecture about why this is bad for people in their state and in their state. And the undertone in a lot of ways is, if you don't play ball, there's going to be a cost to pay on the other side of things, on the campaign trail. That influence can come in and play a very, very important role in, certain votes that we cared a lot about, like a domestic workers' bill of rights. When that certain amount of corporate influence descends, there are a lot of votes from people who you'd think would go one direction that actually start to go in a less progressive direction. I mention all of this in response to the question that you asked, to say that it feels a lot of times in Olympia that there is an invisible force that you might not always be able to see it, but after the session is done, you can certainly quantify it in the depth of cuts that are made, the reluctance to pursue certain tax options, and a general sense that we are not maximizing what we could be doing as a state with ostensibly very progressive values. So the antidote has to be, there has to be as much of a presence of the kind that we see here in Olympia as there is among the major corporations that have that very intense lobbying presence. So that ideally you would like to see, people from labor unions or working and everyday people, students, teachers, taking that selfie from the Senate steps and feeling that they actually have a sense of what goes on, a sense of authorship, I should say, over what goes on in the state capitol. And so I think it's going to have to be a movement solution because, as Senator Frame had mentioned, many of the technocratic solutions, we have addressed many of those issues, right? The fact that people are down to kind of their last out when it comes to, well, if you pass this tax, we're going to leave. There's so many other arguments that had to be won in order to get to the point where that is the last card to play. And the way that you, I think, sort of keep that pressure on and to make it so that this is not only a technocratic issue that we are trying to solve. It's not only about the charts, as beautiful as the charts are, only about the bar graphs, as great to look at as those have been. It's also a movement solution as well, and one that's going to have to involve people actually sacrificing, making the trip to come down to Olympia to testify, engage in civil disobedience if you're so inclined to. These are the things that tend to historically move the needle, and they are the very dirty work of movement building that I think can be an antidote to the kind of corporate presence that we see that has stalled progress on a lot of these issues.
Well, thank you so much. Fatima, go ahead.
Can you say the question again?
Yeah. Well, one second.
Am I talking for that long?
It's just very inspiring.
So from your perspective, what will it take? What do you think it will take to change the way our tax code works? And what would meaningful progress look like in 2026 to prioritize everyday people?
And so I think Representative Scott is completely right. What this is going to take is having people overwhelmingly show up to say that what these corporations are talking about does not represent what we actually believe. And that's why I started Tech for Taxes, and that's why if anybody here knows any tech workers, please send them my way, and I will talk to them about this. I think what we saw with the election most recently, progressive revenue champions overwhelmingly won their elections. People care about progressive revenue, and people understand what it means. Washingtonians are not stupid. They can hear what corporations are saying, understand that it's a lie, and when you galvanize them and you mobilize them, they can actually show up and say, hey, I'm here, and I'm here to say that I care about progressive revenue. Even really rich tech people will say, I care about progressive revenue, and I'll pay a tax if it means that my neighbors can eat or my kids can go to childcare programs that are affordable. So I really think this next session is going to be, it's going to rely a lot on our power as a coalition to do grassroots mobilization and bring those people down to Olympia, bring them in on the online or signing in pro for all of these bills. If we're constantly putting out fires, we're never going to be able to build a fireproof house. And if we just focus on how we're going to close this gap and how we're going to close the next gap, we're never going to accomplish our goals. And I'm seeing a lot of opportunity next session to start building that fireproof house.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Yeah, it's going to take all of us. So it's time to huddle up and put our hands in and commit ourselves to working hard in 2026 to help give Governor Ferguson the confidence to sign a wealth tax bill. I would be remiss if I didn't mention one other thing. Washington could make some progress on strengthening its capital gains excise tax. It could decouple from the federal tax provision the qualified small business stock exemption. It's a little weedsy, sorry. But that's an exemption at the federal level. In the Trump tax bill, it was expanded. Groups from our group to conservative-leaning groups do not like this exemption. It's a waste of money. It allows venture capitalists who overwhelmingly earn over $1 million receive a 100% exemption on early investments that they pull out after a few years. again, it was expanded, made easier to manipulate. Tax lawyers have learned how to manipulate it. The cost of this exemption has ballooned over the years. So Washington should decouple from that. Could raise about $55 million in 2026. So hopefully that's something that's a bit easier, but still progressive and is strengthening the tax code.
Thank you so much. Senator Frame, bring us home.
Well, you've heard a lot today about all of us rising up, and I'll just say, to borrow a line from the next mayor of Seattle, which has been determined. As she says, this is our city, and what I'll say is this is our state. It's time to fight back, rise up, stand up, fight back, demand that we finally have a tax code that matches our values. Demand that we create access to good public schools, childcare, healthcare, housing. Like, we can do this. So I totally agree with everybody on the stage that you all are the people that are going to do that grassroots organizing that brings our constituents to Olympia to make us do it. And I will just say, too, and I love that you went to the weeds, fellow tax nerds. Work with us as your partners in the legislature. There are many of us that are diligently working behind the scenes to find out what's the move now, what's the move later. Do not let anybody tell you just because something doesn't generate revenue tomorrow, it's not worth doing. That's why we're in this pickle in the first place, because people don't pass bills when they should. There's a number of moves that we could make, and we are trying to put that puzzle together and think about the timing. And if you are engaged with Balance Our Tax Code, Budget and Policy Center, Economic Opportunity Institute, Tech for Taxes, and all of the organizations that are here today, you will be in the know about what the moves are that we're going to make, and we hope that you'll join us in supporting them.
Thank you so much. Everybody, a round of applause for our keynote panelists. And continue that applause for Mia Shigemura, who made these wonderful graphs. Mia's been leading some really excellent analysis on our revenue, and we can't wait for it to continue. I'm going to pass, I think, to Eli now.
So thank you all so much. I look forward to seeing you both around Seattle, on Zoom, and in Olympia. Thank you.